I'm just going to segue to the next tool, which is called Connector, because what Connector allows us to do is use real data in our prototypes. It's not just randomly generated dummy text or stock imagery. It's information that's being stored in an external database. So that kind of gets us closer to the way websites get built. I mean, a lot of websites are driven by a database in some form or another. Axure doesn't have that functionality built into it. So part of the challenge was figuring out how to get that working, how to connect Axure to something external. And the way I went about doing that was, first of all, I wanted to use a system that was accessible, not just to the prototype creator, but to any participant, any stakeholder or colleague who might want to have a hand in accessing or editing that data or even reviewing it outside of the prototype. So what I looked at using for that is Google Spreadsheets, Google Sheets. So we'll just call it a spreadsheet now. Anyone who's used Google Docs before is probably familiar with Sheets. If you're not familiar with Sheets, then this should still look familiar because it's very close to Excel.
Right.
And the good thing about Sheets is that I don't have to actually use this as a starting point. I could import an existing Excel file into it, or CSV data that will work as well.
Right. So if you've actually got some, it's likely that if you've got some digital data, you can figure out a way to put it in.
Yeah, it might require a bit of formatting. The sheet itself has to be relatively simple. So if you have a lot of fancy styles happening, that might need to be dialed back. Your sheet also needs to have the first row reserved for the column names. Mm-hmm. So often we might just refer to these columns as A or B, but Axure needs to know the actual name of the column for this to work. So a descriptive word for each is what needs to get added. Another thing I need to do with this sheet is it needs to be shared, it needs to be published. That doesn't mean that it's going to be indexed by Google search engine. It just means that anyone who has the link can view it. Or in some cases, you can set it up so that people can also edit the content. But for today, we just need Axure to view the sheet and do its thing with the data. Okay.
So you wouldn't necessarily want to do this with anything really sensitive, like you wouldn't want to put real customer credit card numbers or something like that into your. You wouldn't be putting that into a prototype anyway.
No.
So yeah. So anything that's like anything that you might be putting in front of participants for usability tests would probably be fine here.
Yeah. So just get started. I'm just gonna copy the URL of the sheet from the address bar. I'm gonna need that in a second. I'm gonna switch over to my connector file. So again, connector runs as connector comes as its own library. And when I load the library, there's going to be a connector settings panel in the masters section. So that's what you're seeing now. And I'm just going to copy and paste that URL that I took earlier and paste it into this field. Okay, that's all I need to do to get started. Except there is one more thing similar to generator. I do need to add the connector driver to the stage. Okay, now I'm ready to roll. So the first thing I want to do is I just want to get a column on my column in Axure that shows all the author names in the sheet. So I'm going to take the column name here, author. I'm going to drag the connector column object from the library onto the page. And in the label over here, I'm going to change this default value to author. And this is just a regular text panel. There's nothing special about it.
Right, so there's nothing in the content of that panel that's defining, that's telling.
No, it's all in the label. And, you know, it's always a good idea to have even the placeholder values in the prototype to reflect the output in some way. So I might want to do this.
Right, so when you're working on it, you see that this is author, 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 and then when you preview it,
right,
you make sure that you've got the right.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I'm just going to preview that. Right.
Oh.
So I start to see some data coming from the sheets. Here are my author names. The number of rows is just being controlled by the line breaks in this object. So if I want six author names. Okay, there we go.
Great.
But I'm just going to add a couple more columns. I want the title of the book. Oops. I'll duplicate that. And I also want a category. I want to know if it's fiction or nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I preview that. There we go. So I'm starting to build a bit of a table. You can see how that might be useful. I can also group these columns together. Say Command-G to form a group. And then I'm just going to say that this is a connector group. And for each of these columns, I want 8 rows. So I don't need to go through each individual column and change that number. I can do that as a collection.
That's great. So if you, again, part with your design, you decide that rather than, actually we need more than 25 rows, we want to see 50 at a time.
Right. And that might not be a problem for a table with 3 columns, but other tables with several more. It's just an extra step that can be avoided. I can also say that I want to see books that are in, I want to see all the fiction books. So I can say query equals category equals fiction. I can duplicate this. And for the second one, the second set is going to be books that are nonfiction. Okay. So again,
and now in this case, they're not being pulled in randomly. They're being pulled in that very specific
in that
order.
sequence, yeah. Okay, so that works well for basic tables. But what if I want to do something that's a bit more dynamic, something that kind of gets me free from the rows and column structure of the sheet? Like say I have a store and I want to show an inventory of products with images and different details. Well, I can drag what's called the connector panel to the stage. And when I double click into that, you'll see it starts off as 2 objects, and I can move these around whichever way I want. And similar to the columns that I created earlier, I can say that this one, the first one, is going to be for the author. And I'm just going to change the label. So I'm going to change the text in the object to reflect that. And for the second one, I want that to be the title of the book. Right, so we have column equals title.
And this is where the importance of those header rows comes in, right?
Right,
that's
yeah.
What you're actually
that has to be clearly defined. So I'm just going to add another thing. Make this one a bit smaller. This one is going to be for the category. And when I preview that, I'm getting the first row in the sheet. It's that one. All right. When I duplicate this, I'm going to get the second and third item as well. So it's going to pull them in sequence for as many objects as I have on the stage. But I'm just going to delete those 2 for now and go back to the first one. Because I know in my sheet I have a column for the cover image. Right, this first one here. So I don't need to know the URL or anything. I just need to have that in my spreadsheet. What I do need to know is the column name.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to Axure. And then I'm just going to add a default image object to the Axure stage, to the page. I'm going to say column equals image small. Oops. So that's about the same size as the cover image. I'm going to preview that. There's my book cover. And similar to what I did when I was showing user pics in Connector in Generator, I'm going to save this as a master because I want to be able to make changes to all of these objects in one place. Right. So
right. So then, if you decided you wanted everything left aligned,
exactly,
or bold the titles or something like that.
Yep. Okay, so that's good. I mean, it's pulling the first 6 results from the sheet, but I know there are at least 20 entries in that file. So what I'd love to be able to do is just kind of get people through them somehow. And we can do that by adding some basic pagination controls.
Oh, that's great.
So we have previous index buttons. Cycle through that content. Oops. And back again. And you'll notice when I get to the end or the beginning, there is a disabled state for the button. That isn't something that's baked into the library. I mean, these buttons are just regular Axure boxes. They could be anything. I mean, they could be images, they could be bitmaps.
Right, so you could actually just apply this to whatever your button style was for the rest of your prototype.
Right.
If you wanted to create a dynamic page, you could just apply that same.
Yeah, and because these things are being driven by the label alone, it means you can apply them to any existing objects. Any existing object. You don't feel like you have to work exclusively with the components in the library. If you want to just copy and paste that label to something that's already there, then that's going to work as well.
It's just having that specific connection, the reference on the page,
Yep.
and then having the labels. Yeah, that's great.
So in this case, if I want to say that the disabled state is invisible, I can just set the fill color to white.
Right.
And the same thing with this one. Okay, so now I'm only going to see the one button.
Right.
Okay,
Cool.
good. So what else can we do? We can say that, well, let's show the number of results and the number of pages. So I drag the page counter widget onto the page, and there's also another one to illustrate, to display the number of results. I'm going to preview that. You'll see
Fancy.
page 1 of 4, 19 results, and as I step through them.
And and those are, just to be clear, those are actually reflecting the number of elements
results.
that,
That's being dynamically generated.
That'd be really powerful in usability testing, as I was saying, when people get kind of caught up on details that are kind of wrong.
Right.
If you had to create multiple instances of a page, it's very likely that you'll forget on one of them to update.
Sure.
A number like that. So that's
that's
amazing that
quite often.
you have that generated so quickly.
So the other thing I want to do, because I know I have different categories of books, I have fiction and nonfiction, and right now this is just showing me all the titles. And I can always just group these, and I can say connector group and add a query similar to what I did when I was illustrating the columns. But I can also just do something like this. I can add a set of filters to my page. And again, these are just Axure box objects. There's nothing special about them. I don't have to double-click into them to make any edits. I can style them whichever way I want. But I want to say that when this button is clicked, it's going to display fiction books, and this one is going to display nonfiction. And you'll see in the label I have a way to actually query the sheet. So I'm going to say category equals fiction for that one, and category equals nonfiction for this last one. And let's see what that does. So right now it defaults to showing all of them. I click on fiction. Yeah, these are all fiction, and I still have my pagination controls to get through them. I can do the same thing for nonfiction.
Cool.
So, I mean, for those who try to accomplish something similar in Axure, you're kind of limited to using the repeater widget, which you can get working, but it is kind of time-consuming to do. It's also a bit clumsy in the way it's been designed, and the more objects you have in that repeater, performance really starts to take a hit. So in this case, I can have a Google Sheet with 200 books, and Connector isn't going to download the whole sheet to parse the data. It's only going to be grabbing, in this case, the first six rows from that sheet. And then I click the next button, it's going to send a request to the sheet to get the next six. So it's quite fast, and it works quite similar to the way an actual website might be built.
Yeah, it's kind of a really basic CMS for your prototype.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing that's often difficult to do from scratch is kind of create a search engine experience.
Yes.
I have a text field, I'm going to enter something into it, and when we're doing usability testing, that search field will often take people to a search results page, but the results are usually just placeholder text and meaningless, and we often have to point people to one result specifically and say, well, let's pretend that you want this one.
Because that's the instance of the prototype that we built out. Yeah.
So let's try to do something a bit fancier with Connector. Let's use the search widget and get that onto the page. And this is super simple. I can just double click into that. And I want to say that when I click on the search button, I want to be taken to that books page that we saw earlier. And that's all I have to do. So now when I preview that in the browser, and I want to see those fiction books, press the search button. There they are. It's showing me there are 10 results, pages 1 of 2. If I want to be a bit more specific, I know the first name of one of the authors. I can type in her name, and it's going to show me her 2 books. And you'll notice because there are only 2 results, and it's only 1 page, I don't have those pagination controls.
Right.
Those get removed automatically. They only appear when needed. So
that would really improve a lot of the usability testing because we always say, the words that we find ourselves saying all the time are, of course, this isn't really connected to any real data, so that's why what you typed in and what you see are entirely unrelated, or why we've asked you for this to type in this very specific thing.
Yeah.
Doing something like this would really mimic. It's still not really connected to real
No.
data, but it sure mimics the experience much better.
Right. And I mean, it's a pretty basic search engine. It's basically looking at every entry in the sheet for a particular word. So I just typed in poetry, and I guess there's the word poetry somewhere in the description of this book. So that's why this one came up. And there's no algorithm. It's not going to kind of weigh one result over the next and present them a certain way, but it does get us pretty close to approximating how a search.
Which is really probably, I mean, unless you're really testing a search capability, what you really want is for it to look like a search, to look like a good mimic. So that's great.
So the last thing I want to illustrate with this, so we have our kind of digital storefront here for a publishing company, and I know I have more information in this sheet that I have to work with. So I have a description of the book, I have the publication date, and other pieces of data that wouldn't quite fit into this type of scenario. So I can do something similar. This is another connector panel that I've created in advance. So if you remember, I dragged that widget onto the page. Yeah. Started off like this. Right? So what we see above is really just a more designed version of that. And you'll see if I click into it, I can say that the title is obviously being pulled from the title column, the author name, and here's where we're pulling the description. And we have the large image to show for the cover. Okay. So now when I go back to my product listing, I'm just going to click into my book item master. And I'm going to say, when I click on this image, I want to be taken to that detail page.
Right.
Go back here. I'll preview that. So I clicked on the book. I'm being taken to a detail page for that exact content.
That's great. So you just really need to create that one template. It's like creating a single templated instance for your prototype, but it really is. It's going to behave as though you're really generating a new page.
Yeah, and this is typical. I mean, this is a typical way that websites get built, right? You have a master template, and then the database populates content within it for different instances. I mean, we're not. You wouldn't want to create all these pages from scratch when you're building the website, so why would we do it in Axure as well?
Right. Well, because we've had to until now.
Yeah, right.
That's why.
So you could kind of imagine chaining a series of pages together. If I clicked on, I wanted to add another interaction for the Add to Cart button, I could be taken to a page that presents this book in my cart. And we kind of connect things that way as well as just connecting them to the database.